Okay, so for those of you that read the title, odds are you're probably wondering what I'm doing here. For those of you that didn't, this will eventually be a review of Goblin Slayer. And for why that's weird, simply put, Goblin Slayer is years old, has multiple seasons, and a movie. It's successful enough that basically everyone who is even vaguely aware of anime has heard about it at least once. So, once again, now that the iron is truly good and cold, I've decided to weigh in on something that objectively doesn't need my opinion. But I'm gonna give it anyway, because screw it, I've got nothing else going on, and frankly I need the hobby. So, that being said, I know a large reason as to why this show is famous, or infamous, depending on who you ask, is because of the way in which it categorically does not shy away from the horror inherent to its premise. Now, to briefly sum up, several characters in the show are by goblins. Now, before I go on to the meat of the review, I have to ask a simple question. Do these heavily fucked up and traumatic sequences offer anything substantive to the plot, or is this just the author's fucked up fetish? Okay, let me start by saying I'm going to be fairly charitable here. I've done some research into Kumo Kagyu, the writer behind the light novel, the manga, and I believe contributed to the show, but I haven't really found out much about the guy. He doesn't seem to have a Twitter that I can find, he's got no Wikipedia page, and he mostly seems to appear online via the publishing groups that allow him to distribute his work. The only controversy that he's ever really generated is the usage of sex-based violence in Goblin Slayer. So, even though an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, I am, for now, going to work under the assumption that Kumo is not someone who gets off on this type of stuff. So why am I being charitable here with giving this guy the benefit of the doubt? Well, it's because I think that the graphic depictions used in episode 1 are presented to establish a fate worse than death, and to accomplish 3 major objectives.
Goblins are one of the most iconic creatures in Dungeons & Dragons, famous for being low and mid-level cannon fodder.
Okay, so first, the action leading up to the questionable scene recontextualizes goblins to the audience as effective combatants, which runs counter to most popular culture surrounding goblins even to this day. It does this by having the seemingly easy to defeat opponents utterly eviscerate the party that was so confident in their abilities with little to no difficulty. It also recontextualizes the goblins as something beyond mere combatants to be dispatched. By establishing the sheer depth of the goblins' depravity, Kumo sets them up to be irredeemable villains, capable of some of the worst kinds of evil without a second thought, and makes their slaughter at the hands of the protagonists completely morally justifiable, and even righteous. There are major arguments to be made for injecting moral complexity into stories, especially when depicting conflicts between groups. As in most real conflicts, there are very real human beings on both sides who have legitimate grievances, or just simply want to be left alone. And most of them are just trying to survive. But in the story that Kumo is trying to tell, the complexity comes not from the antagonists present in the series, but from the expectations placed upon individuals by society at large. And by making the goblins clear villains, Kumo is able to place the emphasis exactly where he needs it to be to drive his themes home.
Saving the world didn't used to be such a big thing in storytelling. Even the great hero stories were usually about perilous quests through dangerous terrain or epic monster slaying or something.
Secondly, it establishes the stakes of the world to both the viewers and to the point of view character, Priestess. The audience and the Priestess both have roughly the same amount of information about the world throughout the series, and as the Priestess's world expands, so does the viewers. As a result of having this shocking and traumatic sequence of events play out in front of both the audience and the POV character, right at the beginning of their journey, Kumo cements just how dangerous adventuring is, and how costly defeat will be. By immediately establishing the stakes, Kumo forces both the audience and Priestess to confront the grim realities of this world, and determine for themselves if continuing is the right experience for them. Priestess is under no obligation to continue adventuring after the conclusion of the first episode. And yet, after learning the stakes of the world, she chooses to press on into the darkness of reality. And we as the audience are also under no obligation to continue the series after the first episode. And with the knowledge of what will happen if things go kinetic for the characters within the story, I can understand why many people would opt out and retreat from the harsh reality that Kumo is trying to present. Lastly, the trauma inflicted upon the priestess is key to a large part of her character development and growth. Her survival thanks to the timely arrival of Goblin Slayer sets up her desire to spend more time with him in the field, learning how to combat the goblin menace as a form of repayment for saving her from the worst day of her life so far. This has the added bonus of further expanding her world, and the world of the viewers, to incorporate an ever-changing conflict between goblins and other peoples. But ultimately, this is simply a much smaller part of her larger arc. The loss of her first party, in what was supposed to be an easy fight, drives her to try and help others avoid the fate that she was nearly dealt. Be it helping the victims of goblins, or aiding new adventurers in avoiding the pitfalls and dangers that she was subjected to when she first began, Priestess categorically refuses to shy away from aiding anyone. And throughout the series, she progressively changes from a wide-eyed idealist, struggling to survive beyond the wire, to a competent combatant and leader capable of both dispatching goblins and directing engagements against them, which is a far cry from her starting point. Even after some of the focus of the series shifts to the titular Goblin Slayer, Priestess never exits the deuteragonist role, and in some ways could be argued to be the protagonist throughout the entire series. Okay, that's basically a lot of jargon about stories and world building and other shit that boils down to this. The sequences that play out on screen really do serve a larger purpose within the narrative. Now, were the depictions of sex-based violence gratuitous to these objectives? To a certain extent, I have to say yes with a large asterisk. It was graphic, horrifying, and disgusting, and Kumo didn't shy away from displaying the utter brutality of the situation. But that asterisk is present because part of me thinks that this is exactly what Kumo was aiming for. I think that perhaps Goblin Slayer has been labeled an action-adventure anime, where in reality, it should have been labeled a dark fantasy, akin to Berserk, or another title similar to that genre. One in which the heroes don't always win, the good guys don't always survive, and pain and suffering are just part of the world. In addition, the choice to deliberately traumatize not only the character, but also the viewers, is one that I think serves Kumo's narrative incredibly well. As I mentioned before, the trauma of episode 1 is core to the Priestess's narrative arc within the story, and should the viewer make the same choice as Priestess and press on into the rest of the series, you very easily find yourself empathizing with the character's motivations and actions, having literally seen how she refuses to let the worst day of her life define her. Now, could a different sequence of events have been used to accomplish the same thing? In theory, yes. However, and I will fully admit this is possibly a lack of creativity on my part, I can't think of any other sequence of events that could have played out on screen that would have accomplished the same things while simultaneously being more fit for publication. Murder and sex-based violence are pretty much the top end of taboos that can still be depicted on screen. And typically, they're used sparingly, specifically because of how vile these actions are to a general audience. So, for Kumo to deliberately open his story with these actions sets a very horrifying tone, and it forces the audience to come to grips with the fact that not everyone in Goblin Slayer will have a happy ending, and that in some cases, the kindest ending one can hope for is a swift death. Now, I will say my media literacy doesn't always have the best track record. As a child, I watched Starship Troopers the movie, and didn't clock the fact that it was satirizing the book of the same name that espoused an odd form of government that was effectively fascism in a trench coat labeled democracy. So it's entirely possible that I'm wrong on this one. And while I can't think of another action that the goblins could have taken to accomplish what Kumo was attempting to do, I have no doubt that others who are far more creative than me absolutely can. And while I think that the artistic merit of depicting the horrifying sequences of episode 1 outweigh the disgusting nature of the actions presented, I fully accept that for many people, the presence of these actions preclude them from ever consuming Goblin Slayer in any capacity, and that is entirely fine. All this being said, I feel confident in saying that I believe that the actions depicted in episode 1, while gratuitous, do in fact serve a greater narrative purpose, and are not simply the perverted fetishes of the author. Now, moving past the incredibly old controversy of incredibly graphic and horrifying sequences taking place on screen, how does the rest of the story hold up?
Get on with it! Yes, get on with it!
Oh, I am enjoying this scene.
Get on with it!
while shocking absolutely no one, I think it's amazing. I mean, I would have been utterly fucked in the head if I had made an impassioned plea about how the horror that Kumo inflicts on the viewers is justifiable from an artistic standpoint, if I then turned around and said that the horror serviced a giant pile of dogshit trash art that no one should ever watch. I mean, I know you can make the arguments regardless of your opinion on the show or the manga, but ultimately I would not have thought as long and as hard about why I think it's justified if I didn't actively like the source material and engage with its premise. The story is one of the most unique takes on a sword and sorcery world that I've ever seen, both at the time it was released and since then. And nothing has really quite hit the same narrative highs and lows as Goblin Slayer for me. The visual style is great, and while the quality does dip at times, specifically in the anime, it never lasts long enough for me to give a shit about it. The action sequences never fail to kick serious ass, and the stakes ramp up fairly well over the course of the first season and the movie, before doing something of a soft reset at the start of the second season to introduce new characters in an interesting and compelling way. The pacing is something that I think might throw some people for a bit of a loop. Typically, the story fluctuates between combat and adventuring-focused episodes, and what can most easily be described as D&D downtime. Basically, the party goes around a location interacting with various people who are key to their success in the field. Armorers, blacksmiths, merchants, and other tradespersons that are needed for their quests. Sometimes there's local politics and drama. Other times there's some kind of local celebration that requires the character's involvement. Basically, standard world building that anyone familiar with Dungeons & Dragons would identify as a downtime session that focuses on roleplay and character interaction ahead of action. I will admit the persistence of the harem trope is rather annoying to me. Mostly because the male lead has literally zero interest in doing anything other than killing goblins. And so basically the harem trope serves to create character drama between other cast members who happen to want to bang him due to a combination of trauma bonding and hyperfixation charisma. But my gripe about the harem trope, which is largely just a gripe about a trope that I don't particularly like, isn't so large as to kill my enjoyment of either the anime or the manga. Ultimately, the story is good enough that I'm not going to be talking about it, since I really do think it's worth the watch. The main premise is in the title, Goblin Slayer. He slays goblins. That's all you really need to know going in. But I will say that the story makes you feel like you can move forward from the worst moments of your life, and that no matter how inconsequential your life may seem to you, you bring value to the world in a way that someone else will appreciate, even if it's not right away. So, that's it. Not sure how good of a review this will be, since I'm not really covering the plot, even though basically everyone and their grandmother has seen or heard about this one. Also, if the author turns out to do horrible things in the bedroom to other people against their will, then you can disregard this entire video. And I'll make a new one saying, nope, I was wrong about the sex shit. Anyway, hope you enjoyed whatever the fuck this was. Peace!